And welcome back as we continue looking at Python. Before we kind of wrap things up and take a look next at polymorphism, let's first take a moment to discuss the scope of variables, because I think it's important for us to take a moment to pause and look at just how variables are being used and where they are being defined at. So Python, of course, has its own scope of how variables are used. A variable is only available from inside the region it is created. This is known, of course, as scope. We're familiar with this a little bit in Java. We have, of course, local variables, instant variables, stuff like that. Well, for Python, a variable created inside of a function belongs to what is known as the local scope of that function and can only be used inside of that function. A variable created inside of a function is available inside that function as shown here. So, for example, we have x equals 300. If I were to print x, it would, of course, print it out, but that x is only available inside this function. If I were to put x outside of here just by itself, it would throw an error because it is no longer within inside the scope. It's beyond the local scope of that variable. The same thing would happen in Java or other languages if we had tried to use a local variable in that manner. Python, though, also has something known as global scope. A variable created in the main body of Python code is a global variable and belongs to the global scope. Global variables are available from within any scope, whether it's global or local. So a variable created outside the function is global and can be used by anyone. So here I have x equals 300. We're defining a function that just prints x. And you notice we can just call my function and print x. There's no need to have it defined here inside that function because it's global in scope. Now, that gets us in a little bit talking about naming of variables. So if you operate with the same variable name inside and outside of a function, Python is technically going to treat them as two separate variables. One would be available in the global scope, so outside the function, and will be available in the local scope, inside the function. So here I have x equals 300. We have a function that says my function, and here we're defining x as 20. When we call this print x function, right here, of this one, it's going to return 20 because it's looking at the local scope right here inside this function. And so then if I call my function, of course that's going to do that, but then if I print x down here, this x is not going to use the locally defined 20. This one would use the globally defined 300. Now this global that we keep talking about is actually a keyword that we can use in our code. If you need to create a global variable, but let's say you're stuck inside a local scope, so if you're inside of a function, we can redefine that using the global keyword. The global keyword makes a variable global. Now recall, as we have talked about many times in the past, Java is one of those languages that does not use global variables. If you use the global keyword, the variable belongs to the global scope. So here we are using that same function, but you notice now we have a global x, and so it is saying x is a global variable, then defined at a value, so that way when we print this, it would print 300. All right, even though x is defined right here as x equals 300, x equals 300 is, even though it's locally, we have predefined it as being global, and so it knows that you can use that scope beyond this function. And so if we go ahead and take a look in Visual Studio Code, you can see we have two functions here. I have a main and a function. And in my main, I have a local variable that says I exist only here in the main. And so we can just print that off, no consequences. And then we call a function and we then can print a var. Now notice a var is not defined here in the main, but it is defined here as global within a function. All right, and so I just want to go ahead and give this a run. We're going to show a couple things that's going to happen if we start playing around with this. So if we run this, we get exist only in the main, I am global, and so exists anywhere. What if we remove this global a var keyword here? Let's just take that out and see what happens. And immediately you can see I get a little squiggle here that says print a var. All right, so this, of course, is giving me an error. So if I get this, we get an error because it says it's not defined. Now, if I did, let's just comment this out, and let's say I did a return of a var, and then we printed whatever a function was. All right, if we called a function, we could then print that value. But if we want to use that value directly, as we have here, we of course have to give it a global scope. Now, one other thing to keep in mind, if we start using global variables, notice here I had to call a function. If I comment this out and just have print a var here, all right, we get again the same thing. It says a var is not defined. And that's because we haven't called this function. So this is another thing to keep in mind. If you're going to use a global call inside of a function, you have to call that function at some point in order for it to be defined. Now, if we had a variable, let's say, that existed outside of here, so let's just say we have another var, and we'll set that equal to something, just to test. There we go. And let's just say we want to go ahead and in our main, let's go ahead and just print another var. Now this one, notice there's no global keyword in front of it. But if I go ahead and run my code, you can see we get something to test pops out right away. And that's because it is already predefined as being global in scope. Remember, if it is not inside of a function and you want it to be global, you do not need the global keyword. So up here, you can see there's no global keyword. Then that's because, again, we are not restricting this line of code to being inside of a predefined function here. So because it's not defined inside of a function, we can skip that global keyword. However, if we are putting inside a function, we do need this global keyword for that to happen. Otherwise, it's going to be treated locally. And again, keep in mind how we have to invoke this here in order for this variable, a var, to actually appear for us to be able to use.